Oh, I'll tell you. I'll come up next summer sometime.
Okay, but just say so.
Oh, no.
Okay, now starting out, you want to start out with his birth date?
Yep.
Okay, this is the way I've written these notes, and you can correct me if he was born Arthur George Beadle. (1849).
6.
6, is it 6?
No, 49. Right.
No, not really. 1849 at Gravesend, which is a suburb of London.
Is Gravesend
Gravesend.
or is it one word?
Gravesend, one word. Now, he only went to grade 4, if this is worth anything. And he, at that time, the area was very rural. So as a kid, him and his friends used to go bird nesting, what they call bird nesting. They go and steal bird eggs and blow them for, they collected bird eggs.
Oh.
And they'd be away all day, so they'd go and steal it. They'd go into a farmer's field and steal a turnip or whatever they could get, just to, keep them going for the day. And then they fished eels in the Thames. Also, his mother died when he was very young, and he went to live with an uncle and an aunt. And the uncle, in Gravesend, Tilbury, and his uncle used to have a transfer business or a cartage business with horse and carts, you know what I mean? A freight business.
Oh, yeah.
And they used to haul freight from Tilbury or Gravesend to London. And and he used to, he used to help out. This is a kid. He was going to school then, and he was helping out. And I remember one time he was telling me about they got a new horse, and it had belonged to the postman on the same route, and all the way from London to Gravesend, they couldn't get the horse past the pubs until they stopped. They had to stop at all the pubs on the way from Gravesend from London to Gravesend. Also, his uncle had the job of emptying the biffies. Now, the biffies in those days, there was no inside plumbing, so it was all down at the back of the yard. And so at night, they would go around and empty all these biffies into a great big tank, and then they'd take it out into the fields and dump it. And when he got the job of triggering the load, which was and he heard him, the way he told it, he was up to his knees in offals, so they just spill it all out. Anyhow, he wound up with rheumatic fever, and so on and so on. And then when he got older, I don't know how old he was, but he couldn't have been very old, probably 14 or 15, what have you. He went to work for his father. His father was a foreman of a chalk factory. His job was, they used to make the chalk into big blocks, and he used to have to he cracked the chalk to dry it out. Because in those days they used the chalk for mold running. All the fancy decoration around the theaters and what have you, those were all
like for architecture.
Yeah, the inside was all. They used that for used the chalk. It was like cement. In fact, down there was a cement factory, but it was a chalk factory. And anyhow, then of course he used to pal around with all his friends, and all his friends were going to sea. So this particular night, they were all out on the town having fun. He was 17 by this time. They talked him into going aboard the ship with him. Talked him into staying. He didn't know that they were short a trimmer. And a trimmer was in the ships, the coal-fired steamships, which is the deal of the day. They had to store tons and tons and tons of coal, and they were all in what they called bunkers on either side of the ship, adjacent to the boilers. Well, after all the coal was used up on the hearth in front of the boilers for fire, you can figure it. Probably some of those ships were firing maybe 4 or 5 furnaces, so to speak, like extremely large furnaces to steam, get the steam up on the boilers. And then to get the coal from the bunkers into where the firemen could feed it into the fires, they had to have somebody to move it. So they had trimmers, and they had a wheelbarrow, and they went into the bunkers and they loaded it out on the hearth and kept it going. And of course, quoting your grandfather, he never had been to sea before. He said, I woke up in the morning to see the ship leaving the mouth of the Thames, and he said, from then till for the next 3 or 4 days, he was seasick. He said he was so sick, wishing he would die. He'd go into the coal bunker. He was trimming. Now I got ahead of myself. He wound up as a trimmer, because there was a trimmer short. So now he wound up as a trimmer.
Did he think that was a good idea, or how did he feel when he woke up the next morning and found out he was going to sea?
Well, he had no idea. I mean, he didn't know. It was just no, he couldn't. The boat was heading out of the mouth of the Thames. They were gone.
And they were so this was a pre-planned thing to make sure.
Well, they needed a trimmer, and they shanghaied him. Yeah. Shanghai, you know what Shanghai means?
Well, you should I'm kind of interested just in the way you define it. That's all.
Oh, anyhow, he wound up in a situation where his friends knew there was a trimmer short. They conned him into staying on the boat. And by the time he got up in the morning, or woke up in the morning, he was looking, the mouth of the Thames was there. There's no way of going back. So he wound up, now he's got to work his passage. He can't pay for it. So he's a trimmer. And he said, I can remember being so seasick that I was wishing I was dead. Laying on the floor of the bunker, coal bunker, was supposed to be trimming, and some great big fireman come up and kick him in the ribs and tell him to get on his feet and get some coal out, not in such nice terms. So after 3 days, he wound up, 3 or 4 days, I guess, or thereabouts, he wound up where he got over the seasickness. And in those days, They got 2 meals a day, and most of it was just plain slop, hash, potato hash, or salt pork, and biscuits. They had no refrigeration on those ships, and least of all, they had no damn washing facilities. I'll get it if you can remind me later on. I'll tell you what they used to have to do for a bath or a wash. Anyhow, he said I was so damn hungry. He said they got 2 meals a day, and if they wanted anything, you see, they worked on watches, and when they came off watch, they ate, and then they got a break, and then they went to work again, and when they came off watch, they ate again. But if they wanted something to eat for the third time round, which was the third watch, say 4 hours on, 4 hours on, and 4 hours off, or 6 hours on, and 4 hours off. They worked at around 3 shifts. They had to save something from one of the meals they had earlier in the day. And he said I was so damn hungry. He said I was hungry all the time. So he had a friend who was on the same ship, was the cabin boy, and the mess boy, for the captain and the officers. And they used to, when he got off watch, he'd go up and wait outside the officer's mess. And his friend would bring what was left over out of and so he lived on whatever was left over from what the captain and the crew, the officers had been eating. Well, they went across and as far as these guys were working like coal miners in a stoke hole in coal dust, and they were black. And if you check some of those pictures on that Whalers No More, you can get an idea of what kind of grime and grub they were into. And the only way they had of washing up after they were through their watch, with a bucket, and they'd fill it with water and run a steam jet into it to heat the water up, because there was live steam around all the time, and have a sponge bath, or clean themselves, or wash themselves as well as they could under the circumstances. So anyhow, they wound up at Baltimore, and they were going to Baltimore to load it, well, you call it cattle today, but it was, he referred to them as bullocks, which were stirrups or steers. But anyhow, they referred to them as bullocks, and they were going for a load of bullocks. They got off the ship and got a drag on their wages. You get them a few bucks, so they go a few pounds, so they go, I guess bucks in the case of Baltimore. And they headed for the pastry shop, loaded up on pastry. Well, they headed back. After they loaded their cargo, they headed back to the British Isles or London or wherever they were heading. They were heading into London or Tilbury or wherever it was. And about 200 miles off the mouth of the Thames, they ran into a storm. And it was getting so bad, they had a following sea. And they were pooping the seas, if you know what that is. That means the sea with a following sea. The seas were so big, they were coming over the ship's stern. So the only salvation, it was either that or flounder. They had to turn the ship around. So they managed to get the ship around, minus all the deck cargo, which was the bullocks, and half the wheelhouse. And when the storm unabated, they managed to limp into Liverpool. Well, the situation as far as shipping is the superstition of shipping comes from a long line of going to sea. And there's two things. You never go on a ship that's launched on the 13th, Friday the 13th, and you never stay on a ship if the rats leave it. So they got into Tilbury or wherever they were going, and the rats left the ship. So he left the ship also. The ship went back after it was repaired, I imagine. Went back for another trip, and it was lost with all hands. So then he went to ship. He shipped it. Well, that was in 1901. That was when he first. The other.
I guess what I'm trying to figure out though is like when you talk about being Shanghai, like I think somebody kind of ripped me off. I'd be leaving at my first opportunity.
Well,
it sounds like by the time he got back, he's actually sort of starting to enjoy working.
Well, he got to the stage where, as far as I can understand, judging from what the way he related it, there was nothing else for them to do. Seaport town, so he wasn't going to see. When he started out, he wasn't going to see again.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he signed on another ship. I don't know what that was, but anyhow, they were he traveled. I think they're here now.
Where did they sleep and stuff like that?
In the deckhands and the black gang, or the stokers, slept in the forecastle, which is like up in the forward part of the ship. There's the stokers on one side and the deckhands on the other. The captain slept up behind the bridge, and the officers were on that deck. It was sort of a very distinct society. And more so on passenger ships. And they slept, whether it applied at this time or not, I don't know. But at one time, when you went to sea, you packed your own, what they called a palliasse, which was a straw tick. Burlap covered straw tick. And of course, after you finish your trip, you burned it, because these ships were lousy. I mean, and in fact, they were lousy with cockroaches. And I was talking about food and their meals. If the meals coincided with the galley being in operation, like if the galley worked during certain hours, the cooks, their meal, if they were on a late watch, they left their meals in a cooler. You remember the cooler we had up at Soup Leestown? Well, that's what they had to keep their food. And he said, you come up off watch, there's your meal in the cooler, just crawling with cockroaches. He said, you just brush the cockroaches off and eat it. I mean, and whether it applied, and all these ships were, every English ship that sailed this ocean was known as a limey. And you know why? Because the food was so bad that they fed them lime juice to stop them from getting scurvy. And that, I don't know whether that applied at this, because you see, at this time, the ships were quite short. And you could get ashore, get some maybe fresh provisions, or what have you. But the ship's articles, either at this time, no, not at this, it wouldn't be at this time. It would be probably after this, prior to the ship's articles read to the effect that you had to have fresh provisions at least 2 weeks out of port. And that depended, but most of those ships were real hungry. And I can remember when I was a kid going down to the boats at Ogden Point, and the guys aboard, used to go down and bum cigarettes off them, tobacco, and what's the fishing like here? Because most of them would fish off the dock. You want some fish? We used to go out to the approachy ledge and load up on black bass, and then go up alongside the ship, and they'd throw a bucket over, and we'd load up with black bass. They just thought that was the greatest. But anyhow, that I don't know where I was. I got you back. We were right in the middle of the next trip.
Right.
Sort of split ships, yeah.
Anyhow, this was, he went, see, this is that's 1909. The one
I think you were looking for the name of the second ship. The one that he moved to?
no, well, actually, that would be in that in these discharge papers here.
Yeah.
But this is Kaluna from, and this was out. Oh, this was Sydney. That was a long time after that. Yeah, this is. Here we are. But the story after that, see, that was 1901, and in fact, those were all in 1901, and there's 1902. But this one here that is very fresh in my memory is this one where I should elaborate a little. When you went aboard a ship, you signed on. You signed ship's articles, and then when you discharged, if you met the approval of the skipper, you got a VG, which was a very good. That was your conduct and your ability. And all these were everything is VG, no matter whether it's written or stamped. But anyhow, in this particular case, there was one here after this. This was 1901, which could probably be the ship that he went on after his first ship, which was, anyhow, they went to the Mediterranean, and they were so poorly fed that the crew, the stokers, went up to the galley and stole the captain's Sunday dinner. Went down the coal bunkers and ate it. And the captain charged them with mutiny. So they went into some port in the Mediterranean. I have an idea that it was Genoa, and took them up before the British consul with a charge of mutiny. And after the charge was read, and after they stated their case, they told them all to get back to the ship and smarten the captain up. But the captain wouldn't give them a very good for this, wouldn't give them a very good for this one, so they got a good out of it. And then he was still in. This is his 1902, and he was in. Now he's on board another ship that's gone to the West Indies. And the story, as I remember, about that same time, and I've heard this, I've read this story somewhere before. A volcano erupted on the island of Martinique, or Stromboli, it was a Stromboli, and it buried the town, and the only person that survived was a guy that was in jail. But when they went ashore. They went into this place. And they wound up. The thing was that the town was desolate. It was, it was deserted. And they got a whole pile of banknotes, the currency of the island, but the currency was only good on the island of Martinique. They wound up going into the Mediterranean somewhere, and in those days, all the natives used to come out to the boat in what they called bumboats, just ordinary boats, flogging all their wares, fruit and whatever they could sell. Because a lot of the situations in these ports, they wouldn't allow the crew ashore because of the quarantine situation. All the communicable diseases that were rampant in those days, and anyhow, they loaded up. They got these bumboats come onside. These guys are just flogging this money to these guys, and they don't know any different. It's money. They loaded up with all kinds of stuff. And when these guys got ashore, the natives got ashore and found out that they had been duped, they went to the authorities. And of course, in those days, if you came aboard and checked your ship out, if the quarantine flag was up, you couldn't leave port. But by when they found out that these guys, the crew had duped the natives, they shot up the quarantine flag, which is a great big yellow flag. I know that. But by this time they're on their way, so they got away with that. And of course, then he headed for Australia. I mean, he's gone through. Well, he's been. Well, you can read these. These are pretty near self-explanatory. The boats and their destination, where they were, where he was discharged at. Norway. He was up to Norway in the Baltic, and of course, the only thing I ever remember Nan saying, "Didn't you ever have a girlfriend?" He said, "Well, you'd have to know your grandfather. He was such a guy." Well, he said, not really, but he said, and at one point in my life, he said, I bought a girl in Norway a bottle of eau de cologne. So anyhow, then he took off from there, and he went to Australia, and he actually sailed out of Australia to New Zealand, and see, all these are all out of Tilbury, Gravesend, and I should elaborate too. He started out as a trimmer. That's the bottom of the ladder. Then you become a fireman. So now you're a stoker. You can stoke up the boilers. And then when you graduate from there, providing you haven't got, you go. They call it a greaser in here, but in this area, the coast, they're oilers. Now you have to remember that these are all steam-fired boilers. They're coal-fired boilers and steam engines. And if you've ever seen a steam engine, everything is wide open. You know, you get an internal combustion engine, the pistons and the con rods and the main bearings are all housed. They have the pistons, the con rods are wide, the connecting rods are wide open, and on the bottom of the connecting rods is the drive shaft, just the same as a car, but they're all manually oiled. You got to remember they're slow moving by any stretch of the imagination. So they have to be oiled or greased. Some of the more elaborate ones had grease cups on them, but they had to if the bearing what they had to do to find out whether the bearings were hot or warm or running warm. They didn't look at a gauge. There was no gauges. What they had to do was synchronize their arm with the rotation of the crankshaft and touch the bottom end of what they call bottom end bearing. And if they were running warm, then they had to load them up with grease. Well, that was a greaser. And they ran around greasing all the moving parts down the shaft tunnel, and greased the shaft bearings and so on and what have you. And that's what he was doing as long as he was at sea, so to speak, which was deep sea. And then, see, there's more here, New York, and he was on a ship in 1904 in the home trade, which is just sailing around the British Isles and probably Europe and New York, Mediterranean. Now he's in Sydney, and he's in Australia. For Australia, signed on in. It was discharged in Tilbury on that one. On London, the next one. And Tilbury, London, Tilbury. And they'd gone to Australia. So he'd been in Australia for on and off for quite some time. Then he decided to live in Australia. And, or stay in Australia. So he stayed in Australia for a couple of years, quoting him. And he signed on a ship out of Australia bound for Victoria. And he said, he put it this way, he said, I've been around the world 3 times. He was 36 by this time, 30 odd anyhow. So the first time I came to Victoria, he said, I knew that's where I was going to settle down. So he made one more trip to Australia, came back again, and he jumped ship here in, by this time he's, this is 19, this last is 1908. That's the last ship out of Toronto, out of Sydney. He quit. He went over the ship, he jumped ship, went down over the hospital. You got to remember that the quarantine and immigration laws were pretty strict here. You had to have a pretty, you had to go through a lot of effort to get into the country. So anyhow, he went down over the hawser, or down the hawser. And he went to work, from then, he went to work on the May, which is here somewhere. It's got to be over there. I think it's there. Yeah, these are all the Australian, or the deep sea ones. Yeah. So anyhow, here we are, right here. I'm looking at them. I think the discharge papers are here, but this is the ship. Oh, that's the Gringer. That's probably the last one he came out from. No, he did. He wouldn't have had the discharge papers from the last ship because of the fact that he jumped ship. He wouldn't have got a discharge. Well, the hawse pipe is where the ropes go through to tie the ship up, and there used to be massive hemp ropes. I mean, probably 3 inches in diameter, and so sliding down one of those to the dock at the right time. Anyhow, that's the way he got off the ship. And then he went to where he got off here, the Princess May. That was this is when he arrived in the country in 1909. He got off his discharge. Where's that stuff? He wound up in Canada, right here. I think the last one here was that's the Louise. This is the May. The last one here was nine. The exact date, 1908. The 7th of November 1908 was when he signed on. And somebody's written in here, it looks like it might have been his handwriting. Boy, it's not completed. That's when he came ashore. So that would be 1908. And he, in the 3rd of November 1909, he wound up on the Princess May. Yeah, Princess May, and that's this. But that wasn't. This picture was after he signed on. This picture, he went on the rocks up the coast. It was on the run between, I think, Victoria and Alaska. I'm not sure, but it went on the rocks. And the mate was on watch when it did, and they were trying to get the lifeboats over, get the passenger and crews off. They were trying to restrain the mate from shooting himself. He was so distraught. So after the tide went out, the date's on here too, August the 5th, 1910. Anyhow, what they did, this was she went on it at I don't know what stage of the tide, but when they checked the damage, they found out that she would float. They stuffed the hole in her with mattresses and all the rest of it. They had the passengers off by this time, and they took her into Victoria. But he was aboard her when she went on the rocks. Then, now that's the May. That's 1910. 1909. Then we go backwards again to more CPR. on the Louise. That's the first time I ever remember going for a boat trip. That's in 19. Before that, it was on the Louise. Well, that's the one here. Yeah. Well, that's after that. That's 1926, and then there's 19. Oh, the Royal. This is in 1911. He was on the Royal. East Coast, Puget Sound, and Eastern Alaskan Passenger. And that's the picture that's in that folder. That's the Royal. That's after the May. And then he's on the Louise still in 26. No, he's on the Louise in, yeah, that's 1911. Oh yeah. Now, here we go again. He was on, when the hell was the level? He went to work in the dockyard, the Esquimalt graving dock, I think it was 1913. That's Louise 25, that's the way I remember. And the Kathleen was in 25. So those are all about that time. But in between 1911, I don't remember this. Oh, yes, I do. Between the time he came ashore and went to work on the bay, and the Royal, which was 1911. I think that was 1911. He went as an engineer on a stern wheeler running up the Fraser from Soda Creek to Fort George, which is now Prince George. And he had met my mother through her brother, who was Uncle Bob, because they had been shipmates somewhere along the way. And so they were now corresponding. They were writing. That's what it says in correspondence. And she wrote him and told him that she had just finished icing a wedding cake for a mutual friend. And he wrote back and said, "How would you like to ice our wedding cake?" So it came, I think the marriage certificate is in here somewhere.
One of the original.
Yeah. Anyhow, he came back, and I think it was 1910 or 1913. It's in that folder, this folder here. (1913). So then they got married, and of course he went to work at the Esquimalt graving dock as an engineer, and he worked there all during World War I. And then after the war, the servicemen started coming back, so they got priority, so he was out of a job. So that's when he went back to work in the, I think he went to work on the Lillooet. No, he went on the whalers. He was up up on the stern whaler, and then he went to work on the whalers in 1913. And he did one trip, or a couple of trips, on the whalers, and decided that was not his bag. So he quit, he came back, and that's when he went to the dockyard. He went into the dockyard. I think it was the dockyard in 1913. It was, what date is that certificate? It must have
November 1913.
November. Yeah, well, that was after he was on the whalers. That's anyhow. From there, he went to he was in the dockyard in 1913, and here's the whaling company. Yeah, he was there. He was discharged on the 22nd of 22nd of June 1913. And then I think we wound up anyhow, he went into the CPR again. And there's a gap there.